Welcome to Dotwave. My name is John O'Wells, and thank you so much for joining us again. Dotwave is now on iTunes, Spotify, and I just got the email this morning that we're now on Stitcher. So if there's any Stitcher users out there, Stitcher is a podcast platform. If there's any Stitcher users out there, you can find Dotwave on Stitcher now. It's so awesome. Before I get into this week's episode, I need to acknowledge two new patrons on our Patreon page. The first is Mr. Colin Williams, who goes by Modect, M-O-D-E-K-T. You can find him on Instagram. His music is awesome. And I really appreciate you, man. Thank you so much. And second, Mr. Todd Barton, electronic music visionary and all-around nice guy. Todd Barton, thank you so much. I'm very honored that you would choose to support this show, and thank you both so much, guys. So if you do appreciate this show and like what I'm doing here, please consider going to patreon.com/dotwave, D-O-T-W-A-V-E, and supporting our show. Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge this week's sponsor, Boutique Pedal NYC. Friend of the show, Tada, runs this shop, and if you're interested in boutique pedals or Eurorack modules, please consider supporting a small shop and a super nice guy. He's on the web, he's on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the regular places. This week's guest is Patrick O'Brien, who's one of my favorite electronic musicians and also a solid member of the electronic music community. He's been incredibly generous with his time and patience in helping myself and others understand what we're doing in Eurorack, and is also a very exciting performer to watch. We're going to listen to some of his music and have a great conversation, so here we go. So here I sit with Mr. Patrick O'Brien. Welcome,
hey,
man.
Thank you for the invite.
Thanks for doing this. And it's nice when we're both relatively close enough that we can actually sit in the same room and not do this remotely.
Yeah, I like what you did to the place here.
Oh,
That's
thanks.
nice. I was actually admiring your your arcade game.
Oh, man. So I have a stand-up. Okay, so this is for the listener who can't see these things. I have a stand-up arcade machine that I built just before my first daughter was born. This was something I always wanted. For Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
It runs on Raspberry Pi. Why are we talking about this? Also, full disclosure for the listener, we're sitting in a red room.
Yes.
We've tuned all the lights to whorehouse red.
Well, your arcade reminds me of, I used to have a Galaga machine.
Did you
in
really?
my house, yeah. I got it for $50 from a guy that I worked with in radio in the 90s. He was the host of the morning show. And he wanted to get rid of a bunch of stuff in his basement, so he had like a pinball machines. It was like the Silver Spoons, Ricky Schroeder, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, Galaga looks great, and so
Unbelievable.
It was great. I was so good at it because it had all
Absolutely.
original parts, and I was sad to let it go, but circumstances were kind of rough at the time. And
$50.
yeah, heavier than a refrigerator.
Yeah. So Galaga's on that. There's about 60 games on that. All the classics.
Yeah.
So my girls can grow up learning Ms. Pac-Man and Frogger and Mappy and
The foundation.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You know, it's not about Street Fighter, man. You know, it's about Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
All right, before we start or get any further, I want to play some of your music. So the first time I saw you play was at Synthplex in LA, and I've talked about this with Sarah Bell Reed also. This was, you know, she also played that night. And this was just one of those electric nights. I mean, everybody was so on top of their game, and your set was just blistering and awesome. And man, thanks for providing us this excerpt from that set. You want to give us some history on where you've come from and give us some of your musical history.
Sure. I mean, I kind of grew up on a farm outside of St. Louis, and so and out in that area, it was there was a lot of people who played in bands and all that too. Even though I kind of stuck more with the bands in schools, and so I kind of started out originally just. I heard my brother talk. My brother was always playing drums growing up, and so I remember getting off the bus in elementary school and he just jamming to like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, and I just loved it, And
Right.
so I just would always hear that growing up, and so I got it. I thought I was going to be a drummer too, and then the band director's like, "No, you got to try an instrument." I wanted to be a trombone player because I thought it was cool with the slider, and she got me into the trumpet. So I had that and started the piano at the same time because that's what the parents like you to do.
Absolutely.
There's so much beyond just playing music that is instilled in you whenever you have weekly music lessons for years and years and years. And so and I just kept up with it, and so that's kind of where I started. And then high school did the whole marching band stuff and played in jazz bands
With trumpet.
With trumpet, yeah. Still did classical music on the piano. In college, I tried to play jazz piano, and it was just a nightmare. I had an awesome jazz performer in St. Louis who also taught at the school I went to at Webster University, and I just remember being in there, and she's just like, "Yeah, this jazz stuff isn't for you." For the piano, I knew it wasn't right for me because when I played classically, you play every instrument, the bass, you go across, you are your own performer, and so in jazz, it's like, well, I always the part where she said you have to leave off the bass note and just play into the third instead of the root note, and you play the piano kind of fills in all those places. I just could never get used to doing that, and not playing off without having some sort of a clock that's keeping me mentally on time. I just wasn't as flexible with doing that for the piano. But in the trumpet, I could. I mean, the trumpet was a lot more fluid with that, but I just could never figure it out for piano.
I still can't really comprehend it. Like, I love jazz. And it seems like when the saxophone's really ripping, it makes sense. Even if you don't get it and it's too avant-garde for you, it's an instrument that's playing. But the piano is filling the whole time. Mm-hmm. Even during an awesome bass solo or awesome drum, the piano's always filling and dancing around. It's next level piano playing.
Right. Well, it wasn't really till getting into modular before I understood really the essence of what jazz music is. Because now that I'm not just in control of a keyboard, but now you have to run certain modules that do bass lines and gritty noise. You're at 16 different instruments playing at once, and your mind has to realize not everybody's going to play the bass notes, and so you open that up for other modules. And so in a way, I hear people talk a lot about how modular music is sort of the essence of jazz, and I understand why, especially when you're in the journey to create the patch. You have to have sort of a jazz mentality. But having been classically trained made total sense for me in my style when in the front end of it, but I feel like some of it's jazz as you're building it up to that performance in some way, because you have to have these, if you're not giving yourself the chance to get off the mark, whether it's off the clock or just taking something into a different place, so I feel better knowing that even though I sucked at jazz piano when I was in my early 20s, at least now I feel pretty good about saying I understand jazz a little bit more just because of something as rigid and structured as a modular synth.
Rigid and structured, but also just so open and like very free jazz kind of mentality.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's, but yeah, so it's, when I got into college, I had to make a decision on what I wanted to do with music or what part of music I wanted to get into. So I ended up going into the audio production route just because I liked radio.
Right.
I liked being able to do things for an audience of thousands, as opposed to where I think the music path may have led me to where I was going to be a music teacher or something where it's, I can influence a classroom, which is great, but I felt, well, shoot, there's an audience of thousands of people behind a mic versus a classroom. For me, I felt like I could make more of an impact on a larger scale, and that's kind of why I went the radio route. And so, yeah, that's what I ended up doing, was audio production, even though I got into radio right afterwards and started in the radio field doing audio production, because that's what I ultimately ended up graduating with. And so that was something new, because, in the 90s, radio was still pretty big. Like, morning shows were big. You didn't have a lot of the companies that were consolidating into what it is now, and there were personalities around the clock. And so
the role of the FM DJ in our country is just amazing. I grew up idolizing these people, too.
And then you would see him in the community, and you're like, wow, that's the guy I know on radio.
Right, he looks constant. Like that.
Well, yeah, it's face for radios. He
has he has a good face for radio.
Yeah. But I had brought to the table this audio production that they had never seen before, because right at that time, Pro Tools was kind of in its infancy. But I was fortunate enough to go to a college where they taught how to use Pro Tools back when 2 gigabyte hard drives was the max.
Right.
And it was a 4-track. And then if you wanted 8 tracks, you had to mix down a couple times to get your 8 tracks. And so it was great. And I had taught DJs how to do non-destructive audio. And they were freaking out because they're used to splicing tapes, and, well, there goes a piece on the floor, and they got to go back and grab that tape and splice it back together. I didn't want that. And I'm just remembering recording phone calls when I first started in radio, because, while the, Chumbawanga songs playing in the background, you got people calling in on the phones, you're recording them. And so you're doing these 3 or 4 conversations with people while the song's going on. And then you have to go back there and slice all within 40 seconds. And you play this back within 20 seconds to go to the commercial break. Ha ha ha, da 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 da. And doing all this on reel to reel was insane. So when I finally went in there and showed them, guys, there's a computer, you can hear it, you cut, and they were freaking out when the delete button was introduced, because they're like, well, where does it go when I hit delete?
Do you see the little 1s and 0s on the floor there now?
Exactly.
They're right there. Nope, you just missed it. They're right there.
But man, talk about changing dinosaurs. And it's unheard of now. Why would you ever do it any other way? So I was right at the end of the analog to digital. So I feel really blessed that I was in that part. But that's really what got me the gig, was just knowing the audio technology behind it. So
it was a super powerful time.
Yeah.
Stuff was changing really quickly.
Yeah. And so even to this day, I still work for local TV stations, building websites, mobile apps, Facebook, posts, pretty much everything not on television. I handle all the multiple platform stuff in Los Angeles. Right. So, and that's kind of what I've been doing as the day job, but it's also given me a chance to explore other hobbies. And
now, you were doing DJ stuff, and then this got you into Modular.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
Ever since I left the recording studio and left radio and the television, I always had that love for it, because that's what my degree was in. Mm-hmm. I grew up with my brother playing the drums, trumpet and piano. My brother introduced me to the Korg MS-10 synthesizer, and that changed my world at that point. And my family had given me a Roland D20 for Christmas right after high school, and I took it to college. There was a lot of inspiring moments.
So when did you come to Los Angeles?
So I moved here in 2012, and after leaving St. Louis, I left there in 2008, went to DC for about 4 years for work. That was actually the first time that my wife and I were able to live under the same roof. We were dating at that point. We were dating for about 5 years. And she was actually in another city. I was in St. Louis, and she was in Southern Illinois in a city called Carbondale. So it's kind of a smaller market, but it was its own TV market, and she was a morning show anchor there. So I was in television doing all the behind-the-scenes digital stuff, and she was on air in a different network and all that. So we thought at DC was the opportunity for both of us to finally come together after being long distance by 100 miles, but still long distance for 5 years. Like, this is it. So we're going to settle. And ended up getting a house there. I'm like, okay, got the house. And she's here. We actually got married while we lived in DC. We actually had it back in St. Louis for family, but finally got married. She had her job. I had my job. I'm like, this is it. And that's when I started building that studio. Finally, like there's no other time than the present. You know, it's in the attic space of this house. Lots of AC units in that, which I didn't think about until the summer came along. I'm like, oh, this is going to be terrible for my equipment.
Really loud up there.
And really loud. But for the time being, I had just picked up, like the Native Instruments stuff and some, I had my brother's MS-10 that he had given me, and I was just so cherished by that. And, like a nice MIDI controller, and I was moving up, had some speakers and screens and invested in the computer, and I was just going to learn like Ableton and that kind of stuff. Right. And it was fine. Yeah, I think I still kept a lot of the music that I wrote in that time, and it was terrible, absolutely terrible. Would never put it out.
What was the matter with it?
I was trying to do remixes and those types of things, thinking maybe that's the way to go. Maybe I should explore more of the producer side of the electronic music, or just kind of be a ghost writer, maybe, just seeing what that was about. But really I wanted to learn more of the plugins, because I knew Pro Tools back then, but that was right before all the plugin stuff started really kicking in.
Right. Yeah.
And so there
was no VST then.
No, we still had all the outboard gear. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I got to learn this stuff if I want to have some sort of a career change, or just to explore what it is, because I want to be the best at whatever this is I decide to do, because I've been thinking about it for years and years, and now I'm at the point where I have a house in DC, and I got the girlfriend who became a wife, and I'm like locked in. This is my moment. And so I just started learning a lot of the plugins just to get back up to speed again. So that helped until I decided to move to LA in 2012. And moved to Hollywood and Vine, very busy part of Hollywood, but it felt really cool because you had so much inspiration from people who were just starving artists, or people who just are trying to live the dream, and you would hear music all the time kind of in the halls as you're going back to your apartment every day. Of course, you'd also smell tons of pot, and that was just an immediate awakening when you wake up on a Saturday morning and the vents are like, oh, this is smelling quite interesting in here. So someone who had grown up on a farm and was never experienced any of that, and suddenly you're kind of immersed in it, in one of the craziest parts of not just the city, but probably of the country.
Yeah, Hollywood and Vine, yeah.
Yeah, so got a lot of inspiration from there. But then this is where it all really began with the Modular. Because my wife decided to, after we had both moved to LA together, we were here for a couple of years, she wanted to take a job in Tampa. And so I was still going to be in LA, so we were going to have this bi-coastal thing for a while. And I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. Like, I'm just going to mope or something. I got to figure out, how am I going to take all this extra time and invest it wisely? And it was right around that time when, just prior to her deciding that she wanted to go to Tampa, we had gotten kind of not wasted, but I'd say we got a little tipsy at the Carney's, which is a restaurant in West Hollywood, and thought it'd be funny to go and buy expensive synthesizers. So I picked up the Sub Fatty from Guitar Center, and she picked up a keyboard from like a Korg keyboard, and we kind of got into that world. Because she kind of plays music too. She plays piano and all that. So that was my first introduction to analog again, because I had been working and trying to learn inside the box for years and years on my free time. And at that same time, I got sucked into YouTube, where I saw Clayton Celldweller doing a demo for the Hertz Donut version 2, and I was blown away by the module. And that from that moment, realizing you could create such pure sound out of these little modules, and having an analog machine that I just purchased, it started clicking with me again that it wasn't the box that I really wanted. It was the gear that was going to be the source of inspiration. Mm-hmm. So when she moved to Tampa, that day when I dropped her off at the airport, I went straight into big city music here in LA, and walked in, and Steffi was there, and Morgan, who was working there too. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. And I just saw some demos on YouTube. I'm really curious about that thing over here because they
These
had
guys
the demo
smelled
set
blood,
up.
man. They were just like,
Yeah,
he
and of
doesn't
course
know
you,
what he's doing. He wants modular. This is good.
yeah, and he came in on appointment because you have to go in. You went in some back door where you're kind of walking through a little warehouse and a little studio. I'm like, this is so different than what I would consider what like a Guitar Centers of the world and those types of
Yeah,
things.
they are really different stores.
Yeah. So it felt like, is this undergroundish? Like, what am I doing?
Right.
So after about 30 minutes, I got a sound. Of course, you keep headphones on because I didn't want to embarrass the other people who clearly knew that I was a newbie.
Right.
And it was great. I documented it, and I said, this is the moment that I actually left them a really good Yelp review that day. And I took photos and said, this was like a life-changing moment. And I gave them 5 stars. But I also, that was the moment that I said, I need to preserve the memories of what I'm doing. If this is the first day, I didn't buy anything that day. I just more or less did the demo. It took me 2 or 3 weeks before I realized I needed to buy something. And so, but that was the day where I thought I have to document this journey because I'm starting from scratch, and I had recently found my biological parents right around this time too. And so that was giving me a complete new source of inspiration because I was learning so much about me. Just, here I am in my early 40s discovering blonde hair, blue eyed people that are in my biological family and just learning so much about genetics and knowing that my grandmother was a violinist and, all these other things, in addition to my adopted family, which I had a grandfather who played the organ. So you're getting, trained influence. And now I got this genetic influence coming in. And it was just such a great moment. And I felt like it was also a pickup point to do something new anyway. It just felt like that silly phrase where he says, well, the universe was aligned, blah, blah, blah. No, I mean, it just felt like the right time for all this to go. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I had this new biological family who has heard about my music or has heard about my career and all these things I've done or what I'm involved in, but they haven't seen me start anything from scratch because, they didn't see me, my first walk or my first day of school and all these other things. So this was kind of a cool thing. I'm like, well, they're going to see some sort of music, up in some sort of music growth that that I've been always desiring to do, but now was the time. So
it was like an awakening kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a really great way to put it. And so now I'm like, that's why it took so long for me to break back into this, is because I needed that inspiration from this new family I just discovered, in addition to my wife leaving me lots of time to understand what I'm doing and to be in a city that warrants a lot of that, live in the dream mentality and just being around people who want to help you and learn with you. Because I this was 5 years ago. So I even think that 5 years ago, there was not as many people, obviously, as there are now, but it just still felt fairly new to me. And for me to say that it feels new probably sounds silly to people who've been doing it since the 90s, but there's that resurgence era, and I feel like I kind of got in the cusp of that.
Yeah, sure.
And also that's when Instagram was becoming popular and social media was becoming a big thing because they were putting videos on Instagram and you could do these 15-second videos and I was using that as my source of just feedback at this. So while I was gaining an audience online that I really enjoyed, because now that was something that I knew from my work days, because I worked on the digital side of websites and, did the MySpace pages and all that for companies. So here I am now merging some of what I've known for decades, bring it into this hobby. And so that's where I feel like the Instagram audience grew, because I was using Instagram as a tool to sort of see, am I doing this right? Or is this weird enough? Like, what is it that people like? Well, people say this sounds so 80s. And so like, what can I do with that feedback and turn it into something? Is that the direction I want to go? Or should I take that feedback and try something different? Then someone suddenly says something that's a little more of what I think I'm doing versus what I'm actually doing.
Yeah.
So
Modular is interesting like that, though, because if you're in a rock band, if you all of a sudden show up to practice with like a whole different direction, hey guys, I have this country song, but whereas that's not going to go over well.
Yeah.
But with modular, like one day you can do a real beautiful ambient set and the next day you can be really techno. And they're using these same tools and they all feel really good. Like I don't feel like restricted to do a certain type of modular music.
Yeah.
Some of it is because I haven't really found myself yet, but they're all really satisfying to do. Whereas in rock music, we just don't think like that. I'm in a band, it does this certain type of music,
Mm-hmm. There's a handful of modules that I would say became major shifts in the way that I patch and the way that I perform.
What were those?
I think the first one that I realized was going to be a game changer was the Variegated 4, because you're able to do these really glitchy, tight sort of hi-hat and sounds that was just more than just a division of 2, 4, 8, 16 and, open hi-hat, close hi-hat, but to really start creating some glitchy, ratchety stuff that I had never been introduced before without trying to tightly program and creatively use mute switches to do variety. So having that probability on top of the glitchiness and just really opened things up for me.
So how do you balance like probability and generative stuff versus like real performance, sort of like sequence stuff where you know what's going on? Like how do you balance that, wanting the control live, but also being okay with the insanity of generative?
It took time. I couldn't do them in any particular order. I mean, for me, I spent the first couple years really the way I patched, because now I feel like I'm in a really great groove between generative, rhythmic, melodic. It seems to be right now it seems to be in a really good spot that I'm comfortable with. But in the beginning, I kind of wrote for the platform, like I got to build 15-second patches because that's what Instagram allows.
Okay.
And that's where my audience is. Right. And why am I doing this? I guess I'll spend an hour or two building a patch, record it again in the mentality of documenting my growth. That's the Instagram made perfect sense to do that. Mm-hmm. And so then I just started expanding on that, because if you think 15 seconds, shoot, that could be a nice 64-step sequence. I didn't have a 16th second the majority of the time. And so, so it just really made me focus on just this moment with these modules, and then understanding, if I had a filter that could create this at the very end, and how can I create the most complex stuff within a short time frame?
Yeah.
And then when Instagram opened up into a 1-minute version of videos, and of course everybody's like, great. So then my 15-second clips, the challenge became 60-second clips. And there's so much more to learn. Right. How do you evolve? How do you keep people entertained? And I know the majority of people just flip through the stuff, but there are a lot of people who will stop down and say, I need this moment, or they'll save it for later and they'll want to really see something, whether it's a demo of how a module works, or you just came up with something crazy and you just want to present it to the world and just to have it as something you can reflect on. And, so I learned that once I get into that 1-minute patch mentality, then I'm like, okay, I can do 4 or 5-minute patches. And, although I do have to blame Skylar Kitty Spit from Analog Haven in such a great way. I mean,
oh my God, that guy has cost me so much money.
But he is the one that's really changed. There's 2 people that actually started, but Kitty Spit was the one who gave me that text and said, hey, we're going to have kind of a little hangout here. We're going to have some beer and snacks, and we're going to have some modular guys here, and we got some performers you want to play. And he gave me about 6 days notice. And so I had to build something. I'd never performed out.
He did the same thing to us.
Yeah. My vision wasn't I thought I was going to do sound design, like have a studio, work with my in the box software, and maybe I can create some sounds with the modular. I had no idea that I would become a performer until I got that call. And at that call, I said, if I say yes, I'm in it, and it's a good challenge, and it's going to sting if it doesn't work, but I want to be out of my comfort zone. But if I say no, he may never call again, and then I've lost my opportunity. And so I just said, sure, it sounds great. And then the next 6 days, I studied really hard on it. But even before that, Rodent was such a big influence on me because I saw him. He was one of the first people I've ever seen perform at a venue at the Handbag Factory here in LA. And he did this 30-minute set that I can still remember to this day. And he had he's the one that actually inspired me to structure my music in the beginning, to where he did this performance where he went through like 5 different songs. And so he would do, and he's not a traditional song. Like he likes to create, I think he's more of a person who creates this mood throughout the journey. It's like it's one evolution piece. But he did this, broke it down and rose it up, a new song, broke it down, rose it up. So he had like different songs that kind of made sense when you flowed, but they were separate by far. And the way he presented that, and it was still noisy and just beautiful and just warm at the same time. And I was just so inspired by this collection of sounds instead of just one constant drone or something like that goes on for 30 minutes. So I started basing a lot of my performances off of doing 4 or 5 songs because of what I saw with my own eyes when he performed that night. And so if you ever go back and look at my old videos on YouTube, you'll see that the first dozen or so were just me doing, here's a 20-minute performance, and here are the little songs that are in between, 4 or 5 little interludes where I could probably cut them out and make 5 completely separate tracks for it.
And how do you do that in Modular without doing any big like repatching? Like I recall seeing you at Synthplex last year. Amazing night that was with all those performances.
Yeah, it's such a great event.
But you know, it was maybe 25, 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And it felt like that. Like how did all these different moods and tones and songs, or, quote unquote songs, how did these all join together without like repatching everything? Like how did you have so much stuff set up in one patch?
Well, that's kind of where my style started as of now, because of the way that I was patching 4 or 5 songs in one big, and I had 4 rows too. So doing a little in 4 or 5 places, but having one that could run all through several of those songs. Because the joy that I had was the transitioning between songs.
Absolutely.
That's when I learned so much about
That's the hardest part, though.
Yeah. And so to take an idea from song 1 and all of a sudden that idea morphed into the bass line of song 2, and then it morphed into a sequence into song 3. Right. And it's just a matter of turning off and on switches. I think the biggest module, it's so funny that I look back at all the modules and I talk about the Variegated 4 as being one of them, but another one probably out of all of them is just the Muta Jovis, which was from Stephen and Chris at Noise Engineering. It's just a switcher. But they had given me a prototype, it just recently came out like a year ago, but they had given me a prototype of one right when I started doing Modular. And it was just an easy switch to turn things off and on. And for some reason, those switches is what helped me produce my music. And so learning how to create tracks, I guess, in a sense of where I was going from song to song to song, but I am taking pieces of them and morphing them into other things. Well, now I can use the switch to change CV, to change the patterns that are going into a sequencer, to do the drops. I always thought it was kind of fun because I had done the EDM stuff for so long that I'm like, oh, let me just have some fun doing drops in Modular. It's like, I don't know very many people who just have silence and then you hit it. Right. And so, and a lot of my patches at that point, I'm starting to incorporate some of the drops with the switching. So what I used to have is 4 or 5 songs. Now I'm starting to evolve them a little bit more together, and I'm using switching and turning off and on CVs and turning off and on different sequences. So now instead of having separate songs, there are separate songs, but there's an overall theme. So I might bring things back and forth now, which is kind of where I am now. And the Synthplex performance was that, where I just kind of had 8 tracks that I just learned how to build up and bring down. That's probably the first time where I kind of dropped the clock a little bit. So instead of always being on a tempo, you stop down with like one module and you just grind on it for like 30 seconds. It's almost like you're doing a guitar solo and, and just seeing where it goes and being totally uncomfortable just jamming on a module. Because if you were just to take the module solo of a patch and just play it completely out of context, you're like,
What the fuck is that? Yeah.
like, is this practice? Like,
Right,
what is
right.
this?
You and I talked a little bit about this when you played Mott's San Diego
Yeah.
a couple months ago.
Yeah.
About the transition from being very sequenced and very organized, like how I still feel I'm performing,
Yeah.
to where you're at, where it seems like you know all the tools at your disposal. They're all kind of loosely organized in your mind, or this is how it sounds anyway. And then it's a real loose improv.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? I mean, you're not showing up sequenced,
When I first
or
started,
you are to an extent.
yeah, when I first started, I could take the same patch. In fact, I would play it in several places and it would pretty much sound the same way.
Right.
But that was probably a lot of my classical training from piano. Just play the performance. Like it's sheet music or something. And that was more of me challenging myself to develop muscle memory. Now, when I look back on it, it was just more of the idea of getting your hands in there and learning that if I would list everything out as far as turn this, turn that, turn this on this beat, turn that, you could probably teach somebody to do something because I was really methodical about how I patched. You could run maybe 2 performances back to back on YouTube and play them and you'd almost hear the exact same sounds with, variants, but which was fine once I started learning the music. But then I'm like, what's the joy of having some happy mistakes, which happened, but what's the joy in that if you can't get into an uncomfortable spot? Because if you can thrive from that and you redeem yourself from a weird spot or something like that, then that's where the joy in me personally as a performer comes in. And so I thought, why not create these spots to where I'm doing 4 to the floor and then I'm coming down to an abyss of just weird stuff I'm doing with a bass line that just sounds warbly and gross. You're like, this sounds nothing like I just did a minute ago. Right. How am I going to get out of this? And sometimes you just stand back and go, okay, take a breath. You know your instrument really well and work yourself out of it, and you might learn something from it. And if it turns out spectacular, then when you look back and watch the video, you learn from yourself. Like you can watch yourself pull out of a place that you may not have thought was going to be good. And you're like, wow, that was redeeming. I didn't think I had it in me to do that. I think that now my influence a lot has changed because of the stuff I do with noise engineering. I've been helping them with their videos for their new demos. And I think that, I have to learn 100% of a module. And up until I started doing the demos for them, you learn the basics. You learn basically what they show you in a demo at NAMM or at Synthplex. And you're like, oh, cool, I can do this cool thing with a clap. That's great. But when you really have to learn the module, then you discover that there's 5 things that this module can do but you just know the one thing that sells it.
Right.
And so from that, I started working with smaller cases and starting to get the most out of each module. So now I'm willing to take the risk of pulling plugs and turning knobs in the middle of performance because I know in a rough way how to kind of get back into where I need to be. So for me, I get so much energy. Like it used to be, play it exactly how you want. Awesome. Love it. Keep doing it over and over. Tour this patch until you're tired of it, to where now I'm slowly getting to a point where I've half baked a patch and there's a sweet spot where this is where I'm like, make sure I got a video camera going or some kind of a recording device and just record, because I know there's a moment right here that won't happen if I go to bed or it won't happen when I get up the next day, and just record it and preserve it.
And see where it goes. Yeah, right.
And those are the moments that I really have the most fun, because I'll play it, then I'll listen back to it, and I'll wake up the next morning and be, wow, I'm learning from listening back. And I think that's one of the biggest things for me that's kind of helped me define my style, is that I'm constantly recording everything I do. And so to go back and listen to, how did I get out of that hole again? Oh yeah, because if it was just a one take, I would just remember I just was nervous on getting out of that spot. And that's all I would remember from the performance. But if you record it, shelve it for a couple weeks. I mean, you can listen to it the next day, just if you want to feel good about it. But most of the time I shelve it for a couple weeks and I go back and re-listen to it when I'm not as closely tied to the mechanics of the patch.
Right.
And I'm like, wow, that was much better than I thought. And so I feel better being in that space. And so now I'm at that balance where it's kind of, I think a lot of recently my not my style, but I say my way of thinking is by doing a lot of patching from scratch. Yeah. That's got to be.
I love doing that too. Although I don't get a lot of quality out of it, but I really like the process. And sometimes I think art is hard to be seen like that. Like we really do focus on the final thing. Yeah. Like is the painting a piece of shit or is it really beautiful? Is it a beautiful flower? Right? But the actual process is, I think, often more important. But it's hard to look past the fact that the painting at the end just does not look good. But what I learned in getting there and making mistakes and playing with different kinds of paint, for me personally, was bigger than the thing that you're actually looking at. And it's kind of hard to accept that in art because, I'm sorry, man, what I'm listening to sounds like garbage. And it's like, well, yeah, but what I learned on the way there was so valuable. It's kind of hard to separate those because we want it to sound awesome. We want the painting to look great.
I kind of relate it to watching a chef cook a great meal.
Yeah.
You can be presented with the great meal, which is the final patch, but there's something about watching that journey of starting with nothing on the stove.
Yeah.
And I've learned more by going back and watching myself play patching from scratch performances, because when you're in the moment, it's pure muscle memory, instinct, your experience, your influence.
Reacting to what you're hearing.
Yeah. It's your mood. How many hours of sleep? Did you work out? Did you have, stroganoff before you started playing, or, whatever it is? There's a lot of influence in that. And so, but when you capture the process and rewatch it.
Right. It's like, trip out, I did it like that.
Yeah. Like, why did I go for the telharmonic for some chord changes versus just playing it straight off of like a keyboard or other sequencer? Like, but then when you hear the end result and it ends up being pretty sweet, that's where the joy comes in for me now. So while I like to play now being a little half patched and just saying, look, I know these modules enough to where I'm just going to go with the flow and I'll figure it out and it's just fun. And maybe I'll have a little more audience interaction, so where it's not, my head isn't always just straight down and it's just me focusing, but I would like to get a little more participation in some of the performance. But to get that, you really have to be confident with the gear that you use and the way that you evolve your patch. And so that's kind of where I am at this point. And yeah, there's been times where you don't want anybody to ever see it again.
For sure.
But as simple as just like going on Instagram Live and just recording it, like, there's only going to be a handful of people that are going to watch it. But there's something about knowing that people are taking the time out of their day to give you time. There's some energy there that's appreciated. And we talk about the Patch CV album. That's the series that has been out. We ended up going with one of my songs on the first album was a performance I did on Instagram Live that just hit a perfect spot. And so I spent, you can spend so much time just honing in on a really great patch and narrowing it down almost like a classical song, or you can open yourself up to that half-baked patch and see what evolves. And that there's something musical or there's something in the energy that makes that half-baked one. It really pulls out the personality and ends up, for me, being a better performance.
One of the greatest performances I saw of yours was at Sky's barbecue modular picnic backyard thing.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, me and Matt loaded in and brought both of our entire racks and our huge mixer. Only the second or third time we had played. We had all our shit. And then you showed up with like 48 HP or something in like the smallest case. And we're like, what the fuck is this guy? He's just sticking it to us, and everyone's laughing at the new guys with all of our shit because we didn't know how to pare down anything. We're using every single module. We've got 30 voices going. Then you showed up with like the teeniest rack and just fucking killed. Like,
Thank you, man.
remember that? It was
Yeah.
on the patio and everybody's gathering around you, cheering you on like you were like at a, I don't know how to say it, like it was almost like you're at like a casino table, you know, and everybody's like gathering around watching the big roll where he rolls and gets the 2 6s, you know, it's sort of like that.
Right.
We're all super close and we're just hovering over you and you're just fucking murdering.
Wow. Yeah, that was
so-
like 7. I think I had 7 modules in there.
No, really?
Yeah.
So, special treat for the listener. Here's a couple minutes from that amazing patch from Mr. Patrick O'Brien. So are you recording something? Are we going to get a full-length album from you, sir?
Yeah, you are
Now,
finally.
when? When is this, Patrick?
I have one. I'll probably put it out at the end of this year.
Awesome.
It's already finished. I'm just waiting for some artwork. And
That's huge.
yeah. Yeah, it's four tracks on each side. So yeah, it's a combination of some stuff I've done through the demos I've played, and then there's I think one of my first patch from scratches I actually ended up putting on as a track. And
So you say 4 tracks per side. We're talking about a record. Is this like LP only?
It'll probably be cassette, in all your digital releases. I'd like to get a vinyl, but I don't know how much that would work with this first one. But it's vinyl friendly, so it has enough music on each side in case I want to do a vinyl release at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is self-produced.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yep. I love it, man. We're going to be waiting for that. We can't live on Instagram and YouTube alone, man.
Yes. I know it's, I've spent so much time just focusing on recording right now that I could probably do a few more after this. It's that first one that I have the most attention to. Sure. And then from there I can decide to put out, like, I think my second album will actually be just 2 songs. They'll just be long form songs on each side that kind of goes through the journey. And if one of those could be a patch from scratch, that would be amazing.
That'd be great. Just starting with nothing, just simple stuff, and then ends up being a Patrick O'Brien rainstorm.
Yeah.
So I love it that you talk about where your earliest musical influences are, because I think a lot of us who would cite, no, I'm totally inspired by the early Autechre, the Aphex Twin, the stuff. It's hard for us to kind of shake some of that stuff and find our own voice, right? And yours seems to have come from a different place, because you're talking about Chicago, which obviously we all grew up listening to.
Right.
But where does your inspiration come from when you sit down? Does it just come from nowhere, from internal stuff, or is it something you can actually, like, I'm inspired to tell this story? Where does it begin?
I used to say that, if I just start with a sequence somewhere on whatever module, if I want to challenge myself and go to a module I don't hardly use, or if I just want to feel comfortable and not be in a learning mode and just play, I'll try that. That usually is how I always start in my patches. But I would say a lot of the influence now is taking any kind of module and putting it in a spot that it normally doesn't fit, and seeing where I can evolve from that. For example, it's a kind of silly one, but 2HP came out with a cat module like a year ago, and one of the cat settings is a growl, and so I turned the growl pitched all the way down, and I have a really slow LFO kind of going into it, and it creates this really strange growling, just rolling, cyclical thing that just sits there until you tell it, to change through rhythm. It's just kind of humming and floating. So taking that as a root, how do I build on top of that? What kind of, am I going to do some resonance type of things? Am I going to try to sequence off of like a resonating filter? Am I going to start making that growl a little more sequenced and bring it back up and down and create that sound? Am I going to throw in some weird glitchy effects with like one of the Thinky's Tycho or something? Or am I just going to suddenly drop it down and put in a huge like BIA kind of kick to it and take it to a different journey? So a lot of it's mood based when I get into that zone. I don't know if it's just, because in my day job, it's in television, we're always storytelling. We're telling stories all the time in short breaks. It's this story, here's what's next. I'm around this constantly. And so I wonder if some of that, just being around storytelling in a different way throughout the day, inspires me to write in a way that tells stories just on a different platform. And so, certainly I remember things like the Vegas shooting when it happened, that really kind of influenced me in some of my music, because I was around some of that so much being in the news business. And so there are some really dark dystopian patches that I would put together when the wildfires were going on in Southern California. And just being around that all day with continuing coverage and watching the firefighters and just seeing homes go up and just hearing these heartfelt stories. And then, you know, and then at the end of the day, Jono, the end of the day, the sun sets over the ocean with that dark clouds from the smoke and ash, and it just turns this dark red brownish hue as it just evaporates into the ocean. And to be able to see that at work from our chopper and just watching a clean raw feed of that, because it's only 5 minutes or so when that sun goes down, and we always have our chopper in the air in the afternoons because of traffic or whatnot. But to have all this craziness going, or following a police chase or something like absurd, but then there's this calming moment when the chopper comes back to the pad, and they always eye down the sunset if it's at that time. But to do that when the fires are going on and you see that sun setting, it's just, there's such inspiration behind that moment. And I remember taking some of those clips and saying, I want to write to that. It's just, you just see the mountains, you know, because you're up in the air. So you're just seeing the mountains slowly pass over the sun as it's going down and getting that dark auburn. I think one of the songs I called it was Auburn Sun. And those type of things I think are starting to inspire me more than what I realize, just because I'm around it so much. And I like that.
Man, I got to hear more of your music. Do you have something you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I can give you a little bit from the upcoming album.
Great.
Yeah, it's a patch I put together when I performed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C.
Hold on. What?
Well, they do this catharsis.
You just showed up on the
No,
mall?
there's like every year they do this thing called catharsis on the mall.
Okay.
And so when I would go and visit my wife in D.C., it was always around early November. And they would always have this event. But it was really unique because they would have a lot of trippy stuff. And they would do it. Some people were saying it's kind of an offset of what a Burning Man would be, because at the very end they burn like a statuesque of things. But you're on the National Mall, you really can't light stuff on there. So they were able to get a permit to have this structure that they would burn at the end, but it can only be like 6 feet tall. There were all these limitations, you know. So
it's like Stonehenge and Spinal Tap. We're sort of like Burning Man. It's just 6 feet tall. We're just going to burn this little thing.
Exactly.
I got a permit for it, though, man.
That's right. And they had a huge dragon which they had like a DJ stage on top of it. But what was really cool is you had the National Mall behind you.
I know. It sounds amazing.
Yeah. And they had like these igloo tents, and people could go in. You could have a lot of meditation and, you know, the free spirit stuff. And so every year I would go.
Stuff. I don't know what's going on with that.
Every year it just so happened that every year I was going to see my wife, there was always this event. So I'm like, I want to play it. Why not? It's modular. I can do ambient, whatever you want.
For sure.
So I reached out to them and I got to play one year. So it was about a year ago. So part of that patch, I'll play for you here, but it was really an interesting video because I never had people like dressed up in pandas and doing like really groovy hip back and forth, just really fun audience that just didn't care and were just very open to the modular sound. So I'll play some of that.
Is this video available on your YouTube channel?
I might put it up.
Oh, you got to do this.
Yeah, I haven't put it up yet, but
who doesn't want to see millennials in panda costumes? Come on.
Listening to a POB jam. I was thinking on my way down here, I was thinking, wow, how, I was listening to one of my patches and going, how is it possible that I could even take something remotely close to modular and trying to replicate that in the box?
Yeah.
You know, and so having that, but to get out and to play and to perform live, you know, where that's where I have grown the most, is just by the community, whether it was on Instagram or it was out in these events that we have. It seems like every other day there is some sort of an event where a lot of the musical modular people are out and performing weekdays and weeknights. And it's great to see rounds of new people that come in and are inspired by others, whether they see them on social or they just hang out in the back corner of an event and just get to know people. And so I'm glad to see that there's a continuous cycle of new people that are inspired, and there's the ones that have been around for a while that are certainly open to talking to anybody about anything. I mean, somebody could come to me and say, yeah, that mutajovis switcher, like, what's the deal? Why is that such an important thing to you? Like the simplest of modules, but I could really find a compelling reason to have it in someone's case if they never thought about it before. And at least this is how I treat it, and here's how I use it. And some people might find that idea and translate it into their style. And, you know, one of the things that I like to see is just how everybody else, like one of the things I'm picking up now is I'm looking a lot at the ER301 hashtag on Instagram.
Seriously.
It's such a complex module.
And what Jen Sequinox
is
doing with
exactly.
That? My God.
And to just try to study how they're using that module and coming up with some beautiful things. I'm a little overwhelmed by getting into that advanced of modules.
I feel the same way. Yeah.
You know, like right now I'm playing with Qubit's new Bloom, and you know, I like doing a lot of sequencing. I like doing a lot of melodies. And so bringing this kind of into my space and having a little more randomness to some of the ways that it sequences, but still there's some control with it. You know, because I one of my best modules that I love to perform is their Octone. It's just an 8-step sequencer, but you have this flexibility to ratchet it and to sequence it or just playing it on the fly. And I love it for bass lines and odd sequencing and stuff. And so I feel like they kind of got the sequencing thing down because I'm so happy with that. And so when I get this Bloom into my system, I want to feel so comfortable with it, but right now I'm like, what is it going to do? Is this going to be another module that's going to kind of change the way that I play? I've certainly seen that with some of the modules over the years that have really influenced me. And
is Bloom a little bit like Marbles and just the random melodies that it can create, or is it even looser?
Yeah, there's some probability with that, and you can adjust all those things. It's really able to create these fractal sequencing pieces that you just don't get out of normal randomization that you would get with sequencers. So, but you know, Qubit is those guys are in Southern California, and they come out to these, you know, going back to Module on the Spots, they come out to the events and they perform at these events. And so seeing the Los Angeles community, and you have these manufacturers who are also coming out and not just participating and being involved in the communities, but they're also performing. I thought one of the coolest things when we were going back to when I first watched Rodent 5 years ago playing, is that he was performing, and I remember looking in the audience and seeing Stephen McCall from Noise Engineering. I'm like, how cool is that? Here's Rodent playing noise engineering modules for the manufacturer who's in the audience. Like, how crazy is this? In fact, the first time I came to San Diego, I came here with Banna, and she invited me to play at the Whistle Stop down here. And so I was playing, and Tom Erb walks in, and he sits down and he listens to like our show. And this is great. Like, I wouldn't have expected him to be there, but wow, he, you know, what an honor I feel like now to be able to play for the people, because you never know what is it that's going to tick in their head that changes their mind to build a module based off of an influence of you as a performer are giving to them. Like there's this ecosystem that's built in between the performer and the manufacturer that seems to be really thriving in a city like this.
Yeah.
And
it's
so
true.
it's, to me, I find a lot of I'm very thankful that I can talk to them and see them actively being around. And that, to me,
Yeah.
that's an inspiration. Is
It's
just knowing
super
that they're there.
supportive.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had Modular on the spot 2 weeks ago, and Tom Erb came and watched.
It's great.
And I don't think most of the people there knew who he was. Came up, watched, stayed for the whole thing, and left. Just awesome support.
Mm-hmm.
And they're playing his modules for him.
And it seems to be growing. It seems like there's more modules out than ever, and there's always going to be a function that is in demand at some point. And so I think that this community will continue to grow and find new ways of doing things. And
It does feel like it's a really special time right now.
yeah,
Like, I think it's felt like that for a couple years, but it does feel like there's a lot of innovation right now, that there's a lot of really smart thinking.
mm-hmm.
Man, thanks so much for taking this time and telling us about how you do what you do.
Thanks, man. I enjoy it. It's fun having just a conversation about, the process sometimes. And
Yeah.
because I've certainly learned a lot from people on YouTube. That's always been my inspiration. And now that you're doing a podcast and we're finding other places of people to find inspiration, I think it's great that you're doing this too. So it's wonderful.
Oh, thanks. I just want to give a final thank you to our new patrons on Patreon, Colin Williams, Modect. Thanks so much, man. And also to Todd Barton. Thank you so much for joining our Patreon team and for showing me that you really appreciate what I'm doing. Also, this episode's sponsor, Boutique Pedal NYC. Please consider Boutique Pedal NYC for your pedals and Eurorack modules. And finally, thank you to you, my dear listener, for joining us on another episode of Dotwave. I'm your host, John O'Wells.